Tēnā tātou katoa. It's my privilege to open proceedings this evening. Nō reira, tērā te karanga I te rangi, he manu tuia, tuia I runga, tuia I raro, tuia I roto, tuia I waho, tuia te here tangata, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao, haume e hui e, tai ki e. Tau oi ngai roimata ki te tihi o maunga whau heke iho ki te akamatua ki te pau Hawaii ki, tau ai, tū tonu ai, tūtahi tonu ai. Ka mihi kia rātou, kua wheturangi tia, kua wehe atu ki tua o te ārai, kua hopu kina I te tarawhiti o taramai nuku moe mai rā. Kia koutou ngā uri o tuperiri, ngā pauahi o te tuku whenua, ki ngā mana whenua o te rohe whānui, mihi ana kia koutou mō tō manaakitanga me tō ātawhai I tēnei kura akoranga, kura tauwhiro tangata hoki, nō reira tēnā koutou. Kia koe Mark, ki te manukura, tēnā koe. Ki te ahurangi, Professor Tanya Fitzgerald, tēnā koe. Nau mai hoki mai, tau mai anō ki tēnei o tēnei kainga o. Nō reira kia tātou, kua karapoti mai I tēnei pō. Kia wānanga tahi ai I enei āhuatanga o te mātauranga, tēnā tātou katoa. And what I would like to do is invite you to stand so that we can sing Te Aroha together for our esteemed guest. And how this works is I sing the first word and then you take it away. Nō reira. Te aroha, te hakamo, me te lahi ngari e, tātou e. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you very much, Piata. Ina mana, ina reo, ina kārangatanga maha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Mark Barrow, toko ingoa, ko te toki oru o te koro akoranga me te tāwharo tangata. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Barrow. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education and Social Work. My role here tonight is to add very briefly to Piata's welcome. The first of our winter lecture series, first of 3 lectures, and to talk very briefly about the series. Then I'm going to pass you over to Fran Kelly, who will introduce this evening's speaker. At the end of this year, as many of you know, but some don't, the Faculty of Education and Social Work will move from this site to the city campus. That move will include the transfer to the city of all the faculty's programs in education and social work and the staff and current students associated with them. And I emphasise, we are still in business. All of our programs, all of our staff and all of our students are off to the city. The move will mark the end of 100 years of the preparation of teachers on the site and 40 years of preparing social workers here. In that time, we have produced hundreds of alumni, some of whom are here, including Tanya. For many of them, the Epsom campus holds a very special place. It is where they found their passion for education and people, where a love of learning and research developed. It is where enduring professional connections were formed and where friendships and life partnerships were forged. Those connections are rooted in this place. So the move to the city is a momentous change for the university and the faculty and for our alumni and students. This series is part of our effort to honour the whenua we are leaving, to celebrate our past and look forward to a bright future in the heart of the university. I want to close by acknowledging the work of the Honouring Our Past working group, especially Fran Kelly, Hemi Dale and Helen Dixon, who have led the development of this lecture series. I'll now hand you over to Dr. Fran Kelly to introduce our guest speaker.
Tēnā koutou, nau mai haere mai. Ko Frances Kelly, toko ingoa. Most people call me Fran, thanks for that nice introduction, Mark. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here and to introduce our first invited speaker in this lecture series, celebrating our past at this campus on the eve of our departure. Tanya Fitzgerald is Professor of Higher Education and Dean of the Graduate School of Education at the University of Western Australia. Although now based in Australia, she's an alumnus of Waipapa Tō Mataro, the University of Auckland, as well as Massey and Waikato universities. Professor Fitzgerald's research spans higher education, gender, policy, leadership and history of education, and it's for her scholarship in the latter field that I first came to know of her work. Tanya's publications, which came out of her doctoral thesis, on the interactions of missionary and Ngāpuhi women in the early 19th century remains forever on my EDUC 201 History of Education reading list. And every year, students of education engage with great interest in this work, reflecting on the capacity of missionary women to create a little England, complete with its social structures and ideological proclivities, in Aotearoa. Professor Fitzgerald shows that women were complexly situated as agents of imperialism who nonetheless experienced it very differently from their male counterparts. As Tanya wrote in 2001, fences that surrounded the mission stations stimulate thinking regarding the nature of the world that missionaries constructed and ways in which this space was gendered. It stands as an evocative account of the process of worlding that was so integral to the imperialist project. Other of Tanya's scholarship is on another reading list of mine, EDUC 116. In a lecture on gender in education, we discussed the 1917 introduction of compulsory domestic science in Aotearoa as an example of socially engineering women into domesticity. My stage 1 students are suitably horrified by this turn of events. But what Tanya Fitzgerald and Jenny Collins remind us in their book Historical Portraits of Women Home Scientists is that despite the aims of people like Lindo Ferguson and Frederick Truby King, this policy change also led to opportunities for women, to economic independence, to higher education, and to careers in home science education at the university or at the Teachers' College. As they write, it was intended by male academic administrators to confine women to their proper domestic sphere, but it was used by home scientists to create new professional opportunities for women. These concerns in this type of scholarship, critical, feminist, concerned with both the possibilities and the limitations of schooling in the past, and always alert to the small human stories that make history so compelling, defines Professor Fitzgerald as a scholar. The last 10 years has seen a substantial contribution to the field of higher education, where some of her publications have enticing titles like Advancing Knowledge in Higher Education, Universities in Turbulent Times, and with White and Gunter, Hard Labour, Academic Work and the Changing Landscape of Higher Education. And of her book, Women Leaders in Higher Education, Shattering the Myths, one reviewer wrote that through her narrative methodology, it conveys how women leaders have negotiated space for themselves in institutions of higher education. As the reviewer goes on to state, this work rejects the notion that gender equality has been won, instead highlighting the dangerous terrain that women often traverse in leadership roles, indicating, I think, a continual thread relating to gender, education, space and leadership throughout her work, as well as an evolution in her recent interests, since that very early work from her doctoral thesis. Tonight, Tanya's going to draw from a project on the history of teacher education in Aotearoa, New Beginnings, Historical Perspectives on Teacher Preparation in Aotearoa, New Zealand, published by Emerald. And she'll give us a special focus on tamaki makaurau and our own history. So please join me in welcoming Professor Tanya Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Fran. That was very generous. Thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kai ao wanju, nija. I live and work on the unceded lands of the Whadjuk-Noongar peoples of Western Australia. I acknowledge and pay my respects to all First Peoples, their ancestors and elders, those who have come before us and guided us, and those who are with us now who share their wisdom and their knowledges. Thank you to Fran and the committee and to Mark for the invitation to join with you all in celebrating the history of the Faculty of Education and the opportunity to share with you my thinking about teaching, teacher education and the critical importance of the work we all do. It is indeed an honour and privilege to be here as a former doctoral student, staff member and a graduate from one of the last cohorts of the Auckland Secondary Teachers College here at the Epsom campus. So in many ways it's history reliving itself for me too. So this evening's address, as you will see, is titled Enduring Myths and Realities, Teacher Education, Teacher Quality and moral panic. And my intention this evening is threefold. First and foremost, I offer an historical snapshot of the entangled histories, or what I see as the entangled histories of teachers, teaching, and teacher education. From an initial concentration on the practical craft of teaching to the education of teachers as professionals, our educational history is marked by the increasing bureaucratisation, surveillance, and control of teachers and their work, as I will outline. Secondly, I suggest that discourses of quality, crisis, and common sense have contributed to enduring public anxieties and moral panic about teachers and their work. And thirdly, I do want to be provocative and to raise unsettling questions about the enduring myths, realities, and common sense narratives that continue to impact our profession, now more than ever, it seems. In terms of my thinking about moral panic, I'm taking as a starting point the idea that education is a fertile ground for panic, as it provides a mass point of reference for the public. Criticism, fear, and pressure are consequences of unresolved public anxieties and panic about what may be seen as a social or moral threat. The policy antidote to these enduring anxieties, myths, and assumed threats is moral regulation of any perceived improper conduct or risk in order that there is no reoccurrence. Certainly in teacher education, the relentless cycle of review, reform, and regulation, almost irrespective of the country we reside in, is based on seemingly rational and normative claims about risk and harm, and consequently cited as a core reason for standards, sanctions, and restrictions. Moral panic, expressed as risk, compels a level of conformity to a set of standards, behaviours, and beliefs, and can bestow a sense of righteousness on those calling for constraints and the imposition of order. Moral panic can disproportionately persuade the public that danger lurks. The danger, it would seem, and as I will outline, from the unprepared teacher, the unsupervised teacher, and the unsuitable teacher. The myth evoked here is that teachers are untrustworthy and that measures such as inspection, surveillance, regulation, and the codification and standardisation of teachers' work are imperative to reassure an anxious public. So drawing together these threads, three questions emerge. And these are the three questions that I want to look at both in historical and contemporary circumstances tonight. The questions being who should teach, how should teachers be prepared, and how will we know that good teachers are in our classrooms? And of course, politicians know the answer to number three, which are never the same as what teacher educators think should be happening. So I'm now going to turn to the first question, who should teach? Prior to the arrival of Pākehā, Māori had a sophisticated system of teaching and learning that drew on a traditional knowledge base whereby wisdom and skills were handed down. All knowledge was tapu, and individuals shared their knowledge and skills to benefit iwi and whānau. Learning was both informal and formal and passed on through karakia, waiata, and whakapapa. An individual could be considered both a teacher and a learner. And knowledge and skills such as weaving, fishing, cultivating, and carving were passed between teacher and learner. Specialist knowledge that was higher status was taught to selected learners by tauhunga within a wharewananga. Oral and genealogical traditions shaped the gathering, transmission and dissemination of Matauranga Māori. Te Ao Māori was complex, rational and underpinned by an integrated knowledge code and oral tradition network. In the early 19th century, the first missionary schools established in the colony of Aotearoa, New Zealand, were based on ethnocentric assumptions that Māori needed to be trained in Christian values and civilised habits. The myth transmitted was that because missionaries could not physically see school buildings, teachers at the front of a class, or observe the printed word, that Māori were not taught. Māori girls in particular were viewed as specifically in need of salvation and redemption. Official missionary accounts described Māori women as far more degraded than males and in need of reclamation and rescue. The moral rationale was that intervention was necessary in order to save those deemed to be heathen, and particularly Māori women who were at risk of sexual exploitation. Missionary and later denominational schools were framed around a moral panic that unless Māori were exposed to Christian values and practices, salvation would be impossible to achieve. The New Zealand Company, formed in 1839, was a colonising venture that recruited and dispatched increasing numbers of settlers to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Among those who travelled from England were teachers who set up their own schools, mainly for middle-class children of all ages. Teachers advertised the opening of the schools, the services offered, their credentials, fees, and curriculum. Imported from England were a number of gendered myths. That middle-class girls required an education that was useful and accomplished, that middle-class boys required an education that prepared them for university and the professions, and that working-class girls and boys were prepared for their intended future occupations as domestic servants and labourers, respectively. Furthermore, the moral panic here was that working-class girls, not in schools, were sexually at risk, and working-class boys exposed to delinquency and larrikinism. In 1852, the Constitution Act heralded the beginning of Pākehā self-government. The country was divided into 6 provinces, each with its own council with responsibility for local administration, including schools. Each province appointed an inspector of schools. Usually men, these inspectors travelled across the province on horseback, and their reports included details of school attendance rates, lessons taught, teaching methods, discipline, and examination results. Importantly, what the system of inspection signalled was the beginning of the regulation and management of teachers' work. Established in 1867, teachers in native schools were required to live blameless lives and set an example by their dress, conduct, and manners that their Māori pupils would then be expected to imitate. The teacher was cast as the instrument of social and moral intervention and able to instill discipline, order, self-control, and obedience. Pākehā norms, values, and manners were deemed superior, and teachers were expected to actively uplift and elevate Māori youth and urged to accelerate the assimilation process. Suitable persons were selected to take charge of native schools, preferably a married couple, with the husband to act as master, the wife as sewing mistress. Teachers were expected to live in houses with a neat picket fence for a garden in similar ways to those missionary enclaves that Francis mentioned, and model family life, married family life. Although single women were appointed to native schools as both teachers and headmistresses, the main anxiety was the single male teacher. The single male teacher was in effect unattached and away from the moralising influence of any wife. Thus, single men were potentially placed at risk of a sexual liaison with a Māori woman. The moral panic here was specifically directed at Māori women who would supposedly seduce the single man if she herself were left unsupervised and out of the watchful eye of a teacher. In the Auckland province, potential teachers were obligated to furnish a testimonial that spoke to their moral character and preparedness to teach. The image of the teacher presented in the inspection reports of Richard O'Sullivan to the Auckland Education Board was that of a technician, able to control the class and implement the instructions required for pupils to pass their examinations. His formal reports are dotted with references to pupils lining up, their orderly marching into classrooms, and the disciplined hanging of hats. According to O'Sullivan, pupils ought to be relegated to their proper and natural position of insignificance. O'Sullivan was unequivocal in his view that careful and judicious inspection of the authority, direction, and discipline of the teacher was needed. By the 1870s, public dissatisfaction with the quality of schools and schooling had increased, and demands for a national system of education began to surface. Underpinning the 1877 Education Act was the principle of free, compulsory, and secular education. The education system embodied the rules, regulations, and routines of Victorian society. Schools were places where discipline was stringent, classrooms were bleak and orderly, and teachers' authority was absolute. Teachers were inspected, judged, classified, sanctioned, and dismissed according to the personal prejudices and preferences of either inspectors or the community. I'd like to introduce you now to Miss Alice Wrigley. In 1894, Alice Wrigley, a single female teacher at Fairburn School in Taitokerau, Northland, took the Auckland Education Board to court. Thomas Fisher, chairman of the new school committee, had dismissed Miss Fisher for what he saw as gross misconduct. Allegations surfaced that Mr. Carl Christensen, a married father of 4, was a constant visitor every evening at Mrs. Whitehead's, where Miss Wrigley boards and lodges. It was very much a heated debate. Letters were written to the local paper and evidence given in court that Miss Wrigley was a respectable girl and that her conduct is that of a lady whose disposition and general character is rarely to be found. In the case of Wrigley versus Fisher, an amount of £75 was awarded to the plaintiff, Alice Wrigley, and she was able to return to the community and her job. The moral panic that erupted and evident in the newspaper and official accounts was focused on the woman teacher. Living away from home, single and independent, Alice was deemed a moral threat to the status quo. Although considered respectable and of good character by some in the community, nonetheless, the social expectation would have been that while her teaching labour was performed in a local public school, her leisure pursuits ought to be confined to the domestic sphere of the home, where she was under the supervision of an older married woman. Evident here is the interplay of respectability, propriety, gendered expectations, and the intense surveillance of women teachers at work and at leisure. Alice's transgression was that she, as a single woman teacher, was appointed by the previous school committee rather than a married male applicant. Alice, therefore, had disrupted gender norms, and the new school committee had sought to sanction her by insinuating that she was not of good moral character. Alice, however, was unprepared to simply acquiesce. As the vignette of Alice's skirmish with the local school community highlights, gendered expectations marked the careers and experiences of women teachers. Women teachers were required to be of good character and were judged on their social standing, deportment, dress, behaviour, and daily duties. Male teachers, on the other hand, were applauded for their credentials, their good standing in the community, and their management of schools, students, and teachers. The rationale was that for women, teaching was an interlude between school and marriage, whereas for men, it was an occupation, their salary supported a household, and it was the natural order for men to take charge of schools. As with a number of other professions, numbers of women in teaching increased in the early decades of the 20th century. Although permitted to teach in the absence of men during the various war years to ensure that there was employment for returning servicemen, married women were dismissed. The ideal teacher, it would seem, was the married Pākehā male who had served his country. Or, as an advertisement in the New Zealand Schoolmaster proclaimed, it was good men who were essential to the nation's schools. Unsurprisingly, these good men were paid higher salaries, enjoyed increased job security, and were frequently promoted. It was ultimately the woman teacher who was the transient, usable, inexpensive, and disposable worker. Women's work as teachers was curtailed by a web of social and structural barriers, including marriage bars, that were designed to protect men's position as teachers and administrators. It was not until the mid-decades of the 20th century, when there was again a teacher shortage, that married women were able to train as teachers. However, they were required to have the permission of the principal of the training college and sign a declaration that their domestic responsibilities would not be affected by training and study. Furthermore, it was their husband who took on their studentship bond. What is evident from my own reading of the history of teachers and teaching in 19th century Aotearoa New Zealand has been the increasing attention of the public to what occurs in schools. So I now turn to considering the parallel histories of teacher preparation and training, and the question, how should teachers be prepared? One of the first attempts to standardise, shape and mandate the training and preparation of teachers was the pupil-teacher scheme. First formalised in 1862, this system aimed to prepare girls and boys for working in the nation's classrooms. This system was lengthy, expensive, and widely criticised as being exploitative. The majority of pupil teachers were girls between the ages of 13 and 18 years of age who received inadequate training and were frequently required to manage large classes and overworked. Those who passed the examination were awarded a certificate that stipulated they were of good moral character and sound health. Classrooms were heavily regulated in terms of the organisation of the room and what was taught. Pupil teachers were constantly monitored, examined, graded and regulated, and were, for the most part, cheap labour in the nation's classrooms. By the 1870s, momentum was building for some form of centralised and uniform training of teachers. Initially, the Auckland province was wary of spending money on normal schools and training classes. Henry Worthington, headmaster of City East School and a long-term advocate of the importance of teacher training, held classes in his own home. Students paid fees and classes were held for 2 hours on Monday and Wednesday evenings, and then again on Saturday morning. By 1876, the Auckland Education Board had agreed to pay Worthington a salary of £100 per annum. Other smaller training classes were established elsewhere. For example, the Auckland Girls Training and High School opened in 1877, and the principal, Sophia Stoddard, delivered the lectures and prepared the girls to teach at the school. The core concern of these training schemes was to produce good and capable teachers, free from defect or infirmity that the regulations of 1878 demanded. When the Auckland Girls Training and High School amalgamated with Auckland College and Grammar School, women teachers instigated a number of reforms to middle-class girls' education to enable these young women to be able to matriculate at university college and go on and secure degrees. By the turn of the century, teachers were waged workers, were expected to undertake some level of training, and once employed, were subject to regular inspection of their methods and achievements. As public high schools developed in response to settler ambitions and a growing population, teacher training changed to reflect these new demands. In 1905, a new system of teacher training was introduced that aligned with the aspirations of George Hogben, then Inspector General of Education. Hogben had long been concerned with the quality of teaching, and centralised control of teacher preparation and training was essential to his vision. New regulations were put in place for the 2-year training of teachers, university study was encouraged, and the 4 teachers' colleges were able to award certificates. By 1935, a 2-year training college course, followed by a probationary year as a teacher, was mandated. These were all important steps to the development of the profession of teaching and increased public confidence in the quality of teacher training and teacher practices. However, what did not change were long-standing political assumptions that teacher education should be practical, as cheap as possible, and of high standard. From the late 1930s, the government sought to increase the number of qualified teachers as well as the number of Māori teachers. With the shortage of teachers during the war years, untrained and uncertified junior assistants were employed to work in native schools. These junior assistants were mostly young Māori women with at least 2 years post-primary education, and whose role was to provide a link between the school, whānau and iwi. However, many native schools were in remote locations, and there were difficulties in attracting teachers to isolated communities. Consequently, teachers appointed to native schools often had minimal qualifications and little interest or experience in working with Māori communities. In 1940, and in an attempt to address these challenges, the government of the day introduced a Māori quota system. This strategy, along with access to the correspondence school, provided the opportunity for many Māori in junior assistant positions to enter teacher training. By the 1960s, approximately 48% of Māori teachers were teaching in Māori schools. Looking back on the history of teachers and teacher education, it can be read as a story of displacement. The missionary and denominational schools attempted to displace Māori ways of teaching and learning, and were in turn displaced by provincial schools. The pupil-teacher system displaced previous dame or private schools, and progressively the normal school model displaced the pupil-teacher system. Normal schools were progressively displaced by teachers' colleges, and finally, teachers' colleges were displaced by their merger with universities. So I want to look now at the history of teachers' training colleges. A strong and memorable presence in the history of teacher education in Aotearoa, New Zealand, have been the teachers' colleges. The opening of the first training college, Dunedin in 1876 and Christchurch in 1877, were the first attempts to institutionalise and professionalise teacher training and an answer to the messy and complex pupil-teacher system. In 1880, Wellington Teachers College opened, and this was followed by Auckland in 1881. Training colleges received an annual grant of £8,000 to cover the salaries of staff and administrative costs. However, the suspension of funding during the economic downturn of the late 1880s forced the closure of both Auckland and Wellington. By the early decades of the 20th century, however, New Zealand's economy was much stronger, and by 1906, all 4 training colleges had reopened, with a major rebuilding program scheduled for the colleges at Auckland and Dunedin, and an expansion of the premises at Wellington. There was a steady growth in enrolments, although the maximum enrolment for each college was capped at 80 for the 2-year teacher training program. A number of organisational issues emerged in the 1940s and 50s with this growth in student numbers. In the first instance, the government was required to increase the number of allowances paid. Secondly, teaching spaces in colleges were overcrowded, and this affected the quality of instruction. Thirdly, training colleges were not staffed to cope with these burgeoning numbers, and although university staff assisted where possible, this only alleviated the problem. Partly in response to growing numbers of people wanting to be trained as teachers, Ardmore Teachers College, located to the south of Auckland, opened in 1948. As a residential college, Ardmore offered the opportunity for students from a range of locations, both from across New Zealand as well as from Samoa and the Cook Islands, to undertake teacher training. Described as a makeshift arrangement of dubious merit, devised as a temporary stopgap, Ardmore closed in 1974. A further 3 teachers' colleges opened between 1956 and 1964: Hamilton, North Shore and Palmerston North. Notably, Palmerston North was the first teachers' college to open a marae, te kupenga o te mātauranga, in 1980. Established in Auckland in 1950 and operated by the Society of the Sacred Heart, Loretto Hall initially trained nuns as teachers and was modelled on similar institutions in countries such as England, Ireland and Canada. In 1963, Loretto Hall became an autonomous institution, and students were required to sit the state examination. It was not until 1970 that male students were permitted to enrol. The college closed in 1985, and students transferred to state-operated colleges. What then might have been the experiences of students who attended a training college? An underpinning assumption in the early decades of the 20th century was that those who entered teachers' colleges originated from particular social classes and would be cultivated. Codes of conduct were introduced that students were required to follow, although these differed for men and women. Female students were scrutinised for the clothes they wore, and their social lives were supervised. Young women who wished to marry during the period of their training had to seek the permission from the relevant education board. Both men and women were subject to strict dress codes. Hats were required for formal occasions, such as teaching practice and field trips. For male students, jackets were essential. College caps and blazers were to be worn when off campus, and it was not unusual to see men wearing military uniforms as part of their cadet training, but also to emphasise their patriotism. It was mandatory for women students to wear modest clothing, gloves, and to tie the hair off their faces. Women students were frequently reprimanded for their dress and appearance in public places. In 1929, for example, Miss Ashton Warner, an Auckland Training College student, was considered daring as she wore lipstick, face powder, and mascara. During the 1930s, men and women were segregated in classes, although this was abolished in the 1940s. Staff addressed students by their title and surname, for example, Miss Holloway. And this was reciprocated when students addressed staff, for example, Mr. Ray. These regulatory demands about dress, appearance, deportment and behaviour were designed to introduce and transform students as new members of a specific professional group. Their lives were governed by rules and regulations within a dedicated space, the training college. The opening of Rocklands Hall in March 1922 provided hostel accommodation for young women who attended the Auckland Training College. The dangers of a city were foremost in the minds of country parents, very anxious when their children are sent to the city where they are placed in the midst of new surroundings and temptations unknown in the country. A further concern was that the health of young women might be jeopardised by the strain and anxiety of being away from home and studying. These anxieties were somewhat alleviated by their knowledge that their daughters were under the supervision of a lady well qualified to safely guide them at a time when mother's personal care is absent. Young women students, both in college and in the hostels, were observed and chaperoned in their study and their leisure activities. Social clubs such as the Gardening Club, the Drama Club, and Christian Union further exposed middle-class girls to the values and appropriate social activities. The environment of the hostel created a collegial, amenable, and harmonious living environment. Yet public and political concerns remained. These included anxieties with regard to selection processes, qualifications offered, and the relationship between schools and training colleges. What emerged as a policy discussion was a shift in emphasis from training to education. It would seem that the policy solution was an amalgamation of a teachers' college with a neighbouring university. So from the late 1980s, teachers' colleges were under pressure to survive. In 1986, the Auckland College of Education merged with the University of Auckland and was the first institution to offer a 3-year teaching degree for primary teachers. In 1989, Hamilton's Teachers College merged with the University of Waikato, and in 1995, Palmerston North Teachers College merged with Massey University. These mergers continued, with Wellington Teachers College merging with Victoria University in Wellington in 2005, and by 2007, the two remaining colleges, Dunedin and Christchurch, had merged with their respective universities. What could not have been foreseen with these mergers was a policy environment of reduced government expenditure on education, rising tuition fees, the introduction of student loans, and the proliferation of new providers to compete for students and income. And the third question, and an important question, still remains: how will we know that good teachers are in our schools. The policy response in the late 20th and 21st centuries to enduring issues of teacher preparation programs has been a plethora of regulations, standards and recommendations. Embedded in these policy responses and regulations is an assumption of decline. Declining standards, declining quality, declining numbers of teachers, and declining performance of teachers and students. A cursory glance of legislative and policy attempts to address these issues include the following. I shan't be reading these all out. Between the period 1847 and 1990, there are 30 reform documents around teacher education. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and it certainly does not end in 1990. In actual fact, I would suggest it accelerates somewhat after that point. What can be surmised that either the solutions proposed were not extensive enough at the time, or that these were no less than a policy solution looking for a problem. However, public concerns about teacher education, teacher quality, and teacher standards have not abated. So consider, for example, the titles of these reports. These are all New Zealand reports. There's a theme. The policy reality is that there has been no explicit and long-term future mapped. The preparation, training and education of teachers in Aotearoa New Zealand emerged and continues to be reformed in response to a perceived crisis about teacher quality. Consequently, what has gradually evaporated is a professional consensus around teacher education and training, and a distinct lack of trust in teachers has continued. The image now conjured in the public imagination is that the new teacher, educated and socialised within a highly controlled environment of a teacher preparation program, and who possesses the abilities and willingness to regulate and discipline what knowledge is imparted in the classroom. These new teachers are required to take an active part in their own identity and formation as a professional via their conformity with a prescribed set of standards. Furthermore, in their quest to be registered as teachers, they too must demonstrate their absorption of the norms, values and dispositions of an emerging professional. Thus, the myth of the good teacher is part of an enduring historical narrative. And it all sounds like common sense. Common sense that teachers' work and teacher education should be regulated and controlled. Common sense that quality teachers should be in classrooms. Common sense that schools should offer a high-quality education that caters for all. Common sense that students should fulfil their potential. Common sense that the best and brightest ought to be teachers. Common sense, really? Or is it? Common sense, I would argue, rests on a reductionist set of myths that neither serve the public nor public education. The four key myths, as I see it, are: the first, I would label the crisis myth. The crisis myth is central to what is perceived to be common sense. The continuing crisis, usually couched as a crisis of mediocrity, is regularly used to stir the public and political imagination that educational standards are falling. The rhetoric of higher standards, combined with the fear of declining economies and declining achievement, create a sense of urgency that more testing, more rigorous standards and direct interventions are required. The second is the performativity myth. This myth suggest that accountability and compliance will boost teacher quality. The myth offers the illusion that systematic and vigilant public monitoring of teachers through registration, performance management, and the mandated preparation of teachers are necessary and required to reassure the public that quality learning, quality outcomes, and quality teaching will occur. The third myth, or as I call it, the calculative myth, is that tightening control over curriculum, teaching, and standards is a common sense way to ensure results in times of economic, political, and social uncertainty. That good teachers are in classrooms and that good students are produced who are capable of securing good jobs. And the final myth is what I call the quickie myth, just-in-time solutions, that schools will be saved by high-performing graduates who have the magical ability to transform students through the revolving door of programs such as Teach First, or graduates taking up teaching roles before they are fully trained and fully qualified, or performance pay for teachers, or a focus on quality teachers, quality outcomes, and quality students, rather than a focus on whether there is a quality system and quality public funding. All quickie solutions that direct attention away from long-term systemic issues across schools and the teaching profession. And there are critical questions to be asked at this point that can further expose these seemingly common sense myths that have gained a level of ascendancy. And there are four. Whose interests are being served? Who is making the decisions and why? What if what can be counted is not all that counts? And importantly, what alternatives are possible? There can be little doubt that there is an external grip on teacher education, evidenced by mechanisms such as the prescription, regulation, and audit on our programs and our work as professionals. I have long argued too that these accountability mechanisms have gained a level of ascendancy precisely because the public imagination is regularly stirred by myths that teachers and teacher educators cannot be trusted and therefore need fixing. However, I would also say that there is not yet complete control over our work, but there is slow creep. We ought to be profoundly concerned that the grip is tightening as the public discontent with education continues and the list of competencies for pre-service teachers and teacher educators increase. More recently, in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, no longer is there a rhetoric about becoming part of a profession. Instead, initial teacher education is expected to deliver what employers want. So the rhetoric is turning again towards low-cost programs, short-term teacher preparation programs, more standards and more regulations. Just-in-time and quickie solutions in response to a perceived crisis. There is a perfect storm gathering that potentially has long-term consequences for teacher education. Even a cursory glance at media statements here in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia reveal blunt concerns about teacher quality, teacher shortages and teacher education. These are no less than provocative intentions to persuade the public that common sense approaches are needed. And if you haven't read the report, Stronger Beginnings, that has just been released in Australia, it speaks to so many of the concerns that I've raised this evening about common sense approaches to teacher education. Now more than ever, as we move towards a post-pandemic culture, we can interrupt prevailing myths and common sense approaches that locate teachers and teacher educators as a policy problem. Perhaps too, what is common sense can be reconfigured. What is common suggests that we, the public, are the custodians of common resources, that we, the public, ought to articulate a common agenda for a common education that is an interplay of aspirational ideas and practices. Perhaps a common sense response then might be that we ought to reject proposed solutions that are seemingly rational and shrouded in research data and best practice mythologies. That we ought to reject soundbite-worthy voices, and it's usually the singular voice, that dominate debates and which capture the public imagination. That we ought to reject public crisis discourses that suggest an absence of quality in the profession and our professional work. That we ought to reject a nostalgic rhetoric of common sense and quick solutions. And that we ought to reject policy-based evidence-making. What is needed is a reconceptualisation of teacher education and the reclaiming of this intellectual space by education professionals across schools, kura, universities and wānanga. In other words, critical insubordination. Critical insubordination about what matters. Critical insubordination in which our voices as educators are raised and heard. Critical insubordination is, I suggest, a professional obligation. It's about raising critical and important public questions about what is going on. It is about stimulating debates and resisting the seduction or temptation to offer rapid responses or just-in-time responses to perceived problems of policy and practice. If we are to raise provocative questions, it is critical that we do not seek out easy answers or indeed suggest quick solutions. It is not important that we have consensus either about what our work as teacher educators ought to involve. Rather, a multiplicity of professional voices and views are important. If not critical, if we are genuinely to move away from the one-size-fits-all policy approaches that frequently are designed and implemented. Indeed, the struggle over ideas, values and ideals ought to be part of our research agenda. Research that is central to and informed by professional practices, professional knowledges and professional voices. The 21st century is both an exciting and dangerous time for teacher education. There is real opportunity to dismantle teacher education as a commodity in the educational marketplace to one that genuinely engages teachers, students, whānau and community in the provision of a high quality and equitable education for all. The challenge is to think differently about these issues and to propose new ideas to address historical myths and problems. Much of what exists today is based on enduring myths about who should teach, how teachers should be prepared, and what teachers ought to do in classrooms. So I want to conclude by saying that teaching and teaching about teaching is complex, messy, challenging, and deeply rewarding work. Yet there are questions that remain to be asked about the crucial and continuing role and intellectual contribution of universities to teacher education, and about our willingness to take risks and to rethink approaches to teacher education that is grounded in our professional roles, agency, authority, and practices. These are, I suggest, the challenges to take forward as we continue to celebrate our educational history. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'll step away.
Thank you so much for that. That was just wonderful. We didn't discuss this, but do you want to take some
Absolutely, absolutely.
Questions, comments, observations? Yeah.
Kia ora.
Really stimulating and thinking about our history and where we're going currently in our country. You said just now that you think there's opportunities to dismantle the market model and teach ahead. What makes you think that?
I would suggest that we're at a confluence at the moment, and some of that is thinking about Australia at the moment, and particularly Australia is a state-based system rather than a federal system, so thinking about what we can do perhaps in Western Australia. Because there's so much uncertainty about teacher education in this latest report that's come out, so we've gone from the good teacher to the capable teacher to the classroom-ready teacher to the strong teacher. I think the people in power don't actually know what they're talking about because they keep changing the language. So it's about talking back. And so presumably 41 universities, let alone the private providers, are now having to reaccredit all their programs. That's 600 programs across Australia. If we all said no, then what? It puts the state government and the federal government, for example, in a very difficult position because there's a huge crisis of, as there is worldwide, teacher shortages, and there's now a principal shortage that's looming. So if we are able to exercise, I would say, that kind of agency and saying no, we won't, we work in an autonomous institution, which is what a university is, then it's kind of chess pieces on the board at the moment, and I think that's the way to do that, because we also know from the research evidence that programs like Teach First don't work, and there's been considerable evidence of that, particularly in the US. So it's about reclaiming the space for ourselves and saying, no, we're actually not going to do this. You know, so that's how I think it's really important that we can reclaim that space by saying we are an autonomous institution and pushing back. It would take a brave Vice-Chancellor to do that, because what they put at risk is the funding. Yeah, you don't get between a Vice-Chancellor and funding. I have learnt that many a time. You know, but maybe it is about, you know, there's discussion around, particularly in Australia, because it's the context in which I'm working at the moment, around reclaiming the space of higher education. And universities really taking seriously that critic and conscience of society role. So there's a lot of work being done around that at the moment, and thinking about university governance models, and it's opening up spaces in the professions. But I often say to my colleagues in the Australian Council of Deans of Education, you wouldn't put this to a law dean or a medical dean or somebody in architecture. Why is it that education rolls over so easily? And I think we can talk back to that, because you know, when you look at the other professions, and particularly professions linked in universities for accreditation, the people at the forefront of those professions would not have politicians telling them quite the same things as teacher educators say, yeah, thanks, bring on the next reform. You know, sorry, it's a long answer to the question. Yeah, and maybe that you know, becoming a little bit more radicalised would be a good thing for deans of education. Yeah. Australia, perhaps. I'm not. Yeah. Yeah, because you just wouldn't get away with it in the other professions, you know. So, yeah.
We had a similar issue with Teachers' Council.
Yes.
Which is increasingly regulating university
Yeah.
programs. And I think, if I'm right, I mean, nurses a decade or so ago told their regulatory body just to do exactly the same thing.
Yep. Go away.
But we have to do nothing.
No, I just wonder why that complacency is there. Don't know. It's like that model of those students all nicely lined up in classrooms, you know, in the 19th century. Why do we do that? Yeah. Particularly now when there's this kind of opportunity with a teacher shortage, because let's not be compliant. You know, maybe we can, yeah. Yeah.
So, sorry, can I ask about that?
Absolutely.
Michael Apple in the late 70s,
Yep.
first talked about the deprofessionalisation of teaching.
Yeah.
Can you see this internationally in terms of what's happening here and what's happening in Australia? Is that general sort of deprofessionalisation of teaching?
Oh, yeah, and look, I talk a lot about policy, not tonight obviously, but policy borrowing, and I see trends elsewhere. So if you really want to see, in my worldview, is looking at the deprofessionalising of teacher education as in England, particularly now where you've got a whole different kinds of schooling systems, and not just local government school systems, but you've got these multi-academy trusts. So now teachers, rather than, and this really started with Tony Blair, rather than teachers going to the university for teacher education, they're being enrolled via the school. And then the school contracts in consultants, usually from the university, to deliver, and this is the kind of word, the language being used, deliver the theory. And of course, I suspect what happens in the school as well, they've delivered, now we'll get back to the real job. You know, there's that discourse there. So the privatisation of public policy, public educational policy, and the privatisation of teacher education is certainly happening in England. And there seems to have been a policy shift. Travelling policy is what Jenny Elsker talks about. So when I had a look, for example, on the early teacher appraisal started in England, went to New Zealand, imported almost without thinking about whether that was appropriate, then went to Victoria in Australia, and then to the rest of Australia. So there seems to be this policy cycle, you know, that happens there, and that is concerning. Yeah, and it's happened not just with that performance pay for teachers, same trajectory, those kinds of things. And then you see it in the university reforms, it seems to be that way around as well. So it's concerning. As too is, you know, we in the Graduate School of Education are under a lot of pressure to put students in schools after 6 weeks. You know, and so they're paid as teachers. Well, they're not paid a full rate, it's a limited authority to teach, right? And they're not trained and qualified. And when I was a teacher, I know that the NZPPTA were absolutely adamant, trained and qualified teachers in schools, but somehow that policy seems to have slipped by the teacher unions in Australia, which aren't a united body because it's all state-based, but yeah. So you know, all of those sorts of things is a very slippery slope. Very slippery slope. But I notice they don't do that in the high fee paying schools. I really had to say that. High fee. Oh.
Kia ora. Here's your present. I'll try again. The point of this lecture series was to honour our past, to look at it, and to think about the future. And I think Tanya's set us off really nicely on that path. Thank you very, very much. I mean, very timely, not only because we're moving initial teacher education and other things from a sort of a peripheral site into the heart of the beast of the university, which brings all sorts of challenges but also opportunities. But also we're moving into what feels to me like a very hotly contested election, and initial teacher education and schooling and education is being battered about more so now than perhaps in any other election campaign. So I mean, there's you've given us all a way of sort of thinking about that and getting ourselves ready for that period. So thank you very, very much for being here. Thank you for coming over to New Zealand, back to New Zealand to do that for us. And I'll try not to wreck the box any further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.